Alrighty there. Well, this is Jonathan Albin. This is actually take 2. I am the Game Market Guru, and this is Nycos DnD. This actually is a introductory conversation, if you will, about Nycos DnD. If you hadn't noticed, many of the things that happen on Nycos, that happen in my adventures, happen seemingly outside of time. That the things that are in a time don't seem to be connected with them. And they don't necessarily fall in any particular order. And you will find that, therefore, that this concept of me doing the introduction 3 months in is absolutely par for the course for Nycos, because we don't always get the opportunity to know what it is. We don't necessarily get to know the order in which things have to happen in our lives for them to actually occur. So, in this case, I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about actually how the stream works and what it is we're attempting to do as a group. And maybe this is a little, what's the word I want to use? Patronizing, to actually take the time to mention this stuff. But I envision the direction in which we are traveling to be different from other games groups on Twitch. First off, Nycos DnD, Nycos is a role-play game based in, at this point at least, with the Dungeons and Dragons mechanic underneath it. And my purpose for putting together this little presentation is to give you an opportunity to understand how things work and actually to become a part of it. My background in the games business and in role-playing games in particular is rather extensive, in that I started playing Dungeons and Dragons in 1974, playing under a dungeon master who happened to be one of the guys that designed the game. My buddy's grandpa Dave was Dave Arneson. Anyway, and Arneson, of course, was one of the two guys that published Dungeons and Dragons in the first place. Therefore, I've been a storyteller and world creator pretty much nonstop since then. I actually became a game master after my second session. I realized the opportunities and the possibilities and began immediately creating. As a matter of fact, I wasn't able to get a hold of an actual copy of the games, and in particular not the polyhedral dice, for the better part of the first year. Hey, thanks Cody, welcome to the channel. I'm just kind of going over the basics for what Nycos is in a one-on-one environment so that the players can get a better handle on what's going on session over session. And it's great to have you in the chat, so if there's any questions you can think of that you want me to answer in particular, that I will, feel free to post those. And of course, as additional people enter the chat, if they happen to, I'd be really happy if you could engage them and help them to understand what we're doing and remind them or whatever. Anyway, so this is, again, I get to actually put the sign up now. Welcome to Nycos. Welcome to Nycos. All right. And I'll be using the name thing to go back and forth on what parts of the story that I'm going over. Anyway, the reason why Nycos came to be was actually a strange synergy. I was running my regular games every Monday, and we had a shift in players. A bunch of new players came in. A bunch of the more veteran players wanted to play under different game masters because, well, I've been monopolizing their time for the better part of a couple of years. And so they wanted to give another game master a try. And so that's fundamentally what we did. And thanks, Cody. The group that came together was a perfect storm, and I really credit them a lot with the creation of this channel and with the possibilities that I'm going to be utilizing in the future. One of in particular, I want to go through each of the players that I had in that original group because they really typified a lot of different things. First of all, there wasn't a one of them that had more than a couple of episode game experiences before they met me, and so they were really fresh fish. I hate to say it that way, but the reality is that new players are always fun because they literally don't know what they're allowed to do and what they're not supposed to do, and therefore they're willing to try crazy and insane things. Anyway, so among those players, the first one I want to call out to is my tech, and without Jeremy, this network wouldn't exist. This channel wouldn't even be here. Jeremy Badoni's an amazing and very sensitive individual, and I love him to death. And he was the first one to say, hey, we could live stream these games if you wanted. We could get the word out there to other people and let them enjoy the fun we're having. And his background in tech has really been really useful, and I greatly appreciate that. I think if I looked at Cody's actually met him, so I'll let him mention any words he wants to in the text as well. But his lady friend and young woman friend, his girlfriend, I don't know which one he wants to call her, if any of those. So I'll just say his companion, Micah Gutierrez, was and is a TikTok all-star, if you will. She's got 300,000 plus followers, and she does costuming, and she does cosplay, and she does voices. She's on weekends she does, well, and on weekdays for that matter, she does princess parties. Oh, thanks Travis joined us, and so that's awesome. Thank you guys, appreciate you being with me today. We're kind of going over all of the basics of the chat and the channel and everything, and explaining how the players can interact. But anyway, we are in the how we got to be here phase. So beyond Jeremy and Micah, who, by the way, Micah has been instrumental in helping me understand social media in a deeper way, and has done a lot to help us build up our following, and so I greatly appreciate her for that as well. And next is our photographer, and he is such an icon in the story. I don't need to give much recognition to him as far as that's concerned, but Elder Zamora is an amazing, and I think I'm saying his last name right, I may just botch that, I think that's right, is an amazing photographer. He's got a great eye for natural shots. Most of the black and white work you've seen in association with the channel was done by him, and some of the color work as well. He is an amazing live shot camera dude. Next come the two arguably most talented among us, and that is Alex Grigg, who is a graphic artist in training. He's actually currently attending BYU to develop his skills in that particular arena. And so much of the website graphics, and actually almost all the website graphics, and other particular art pieces that you might have seen associated with the show have been done by Alex. His sister, Abigail, she is amazing. You need to see her art if you haven't already. She is a cartoonist. She captures the story in images each week for us as part of the Patreon program. So becoming a Patreon supporter gets you access to her art as well, which is by itself worth a ton. But she captures the nuances of the characters and how they interact, and it makes it a lot of fun. We have also Alanis, played by Matt Meza, and Matt's capabilities are tremendous. He sees things in ways that other people don't, and sometimes he's a little difficult to comprehend. I don't necessarily even follow everything he's suggesting, but he is not a guy who's afraid to get outside the box. He's willing to risk it all on a flip of the coin, so to speak, and I greatly appreciate the nuances that represents. Finally, we have Roy, and Roy's character, Bathra, which is now being replaced, was a stalwart in fighting for independence in the name of independence sake. There have been some times when his character has been aggravating in seeming to be in opposition to whatever the party was doing, but he has been a true friend in a lot of ways, and he's been in some ways kind of like the grease. He's like, whatever needs to happen, let's make it happen, and I greatly appreciate that as well. But yeah, you were mentioning the veils. We'll get to those, Travis. Right now, we're going to talk a little bit about the planetary positioning and things like that. The planet Nycos, if you will, is actually a moon. The amount of terrain that makes up its northern hemisphere singular continent is roughly that of North and South America combined, although of course it's laid out considerably differently. But the planetary positioning is kind of important. Nycos, as a moon, orbits a gas giant, not a standard sun, and that gas giant is literally on the brink of being a brown dwarf star. Its output is much deeper into the ultraviolet end of the spectrum than the natural visual spectrum. Therefore, eyes are adjusted to a deeper amount of energetic light, and therefore the sky doesn't look blue. Instead, it has kind of a mauve, almost pinkish color during the day, and by night gets to be a deep red, actually deeper red even than the walls in this room. The oceans fundamentally are, during the day, the color this room is, with some places going as deep as a burgundy into a purple. But for the most part, the visual spectrum just is shifted. It's not really so much different because, of course, the visual light is still the primary light source for characters. The planet has a rather elliptical orbit. The majority of its days per month are behind or in the direct light of Nimbus only, but for a short period of time, which I think comes out to roughly about a week and a half, there is also the light of Helios, which is the yellow star around which the brown dwarf star orbits. And this other light source, Helios, represents itself in the sky as a pinpoint, more brilliant than any star that we see, but certainly not as bright as our sun at its range. Also, positioning-wise, Nimbus is about the size of a saucer dinner plate, about that big around in the sky at all times, and its light is not so brilliant as that you cannot look at it, because are there any other land masses besides the main Nycos continent? That's a great question, and that is open for future exploration. I've been running Nycos games for 7 iterations, which means I've played through my story arc 7 times in my life, and each arc is about 6.5 years. But no one in any of the iterations has ever traveled farther south than the Constellation Islands, which are south of the Whisper Mists, out over open ocean. And since there are no stellar bodies by which to navigate, the terror of being out over the open ocean with no means of recognition of where you are has kept anyone from ever traversing the continental equator. Let's see. Yeah. And Travis Hancock is with us, and he's been a good friend for a really long time, and he's been in several of the Nycos adventures. And he, like Cody, have definitely made an imprint on the world, if you will. And Travis, is particularly terrified of the oceans. So anyway, so no one's ever gone south of the equator, so we don't know what's down there because the northern continent ends right about at the equator. So, and I've actually leaked something I haven't leaked before. So spoilers, too late. The fact that there are the Constellation Islands is something that no one's investigated since fifth iteration. But okay, so back to planetary positioning. Because the Nimbus is so close astronomically, astrophysically, it is actually a resource utilized by a species of creatures that actually live in the gas giant's corona itself, and those are the dragons, the great dragons. Yeah. Astronomically. Thank you, Travis. The dragons that live in the corona utilize a skill or a gift that they all have, which actually probably should be one of the most terrifying of all, and that is that dragons can teleport at will. It does take energy for them to do so they don't do it a lot, but they can instantaneously move themselves from point A to point B over extremely great distances. At any rate, the dragons will, from time to time, pop out to old Nycos for a bit of a spritzer, I guess you'd call it. They're so used to the intense heat and pressures of Nimbus that coming to Nycos is a kind of a holiday or a vacation. And the dragons, I mean to slip there. The dragons that live in that corona are, by the very forces pressed upon them, crystalline in nature, and they manifest. Anyway, so the dragons are crystalline in form when they are in the gas giant's corona, and when they make the jump over to Nycos, they remain in that prismatic color, theoretically for the duration of their stay, and then after several years of feasting and enjoying the reduced pressures upon them, they tend to pop back home. But if they are interfered with while they are on Nycos, or if they in particular sustain any physical damage while in the atmosphere of Nycos, they cannot return. They become too susceptible to forces beyond their capabilities, and therefore they can't actually, and rather won't make the jump home. Therefore, dragons that are pleaded with and begged to remain usually are paid in great sums and lumps of cash, and the coins with which they surround themselves by preference only determines the coloration of their armor. So they become brass, bronze, even steel dragons, depending on what metals they surround themselves with. Mainly because it does carry the same amount of, it still carries residual energy from Nimbus in it, and it reminds them of home. The more pure the metal, the more dense the metal, the more energy it contains. So, on the other hand, if a dragon is injured in any way, whether it be attacked or have its lair raided, or even insults against them can cause them to burn with specific hatred, and their colors tend to follow the same spectral spread as the veils. Interestingly enough, very few people have ever seen an indigo dragon or a purple dragon, but as the old saw would go, I never saw a purple dragon and never hope to see one. But I can tell you one thing that's for sure, I'd rather see than be one. Alright, so a little bit of my humor sneaks in there once in a while. Anyway, let's see, positionally, therefore with the rotation being as it is, the beginning of the what I call the helix cycle, I think it's roughly 10, 13 days, something like that. The Helios first shows as a corona on the shoulder of Nimbus, and when that finally breaks to the surface and you see both suns simultaneously, one basically is a brilliant speck on the shoulder of the other, that is known as double star rising, and that is actually the day, the point at which months begin, and therefore some months are uniformly 30 days and other times not. But that's a subject for a later conversation when we start talking about the quantum nature of Nycos. But in the middle of that helix cycle, you'll end up with a day where literally you'll have Nimbus light all day and Helic light or Helios light all night, and that's called day split. And then finally, when Helios begins to recede behind Nimbus again, then that's an area time frame known as Nimbus ascendant, and many horrible or tragic things happen on Nimbus ascendant. So there's a kind of a dark feeling during the period when Helios is not visible at all. All right, so that gives positionality for the dragons and such. Let's talk a little bit about iteration. Time itself is subject when you're talking about a fantasy environment, because literally the storyteller can make anything happen anytime he wants. Because of that weirdness, I have determined that Nycos has a pattern, and that pattern is roughly a 6.5 year cycle. Of course, this was true absolutely until the end of 7th iteration, which we will come back to in a bit. But when the iterations began, if you will, when the first iteration began, the rising and the falling of things was recorded by powerful bards and minstrels who recorded them partially as notes of history and partially as prophecy. You see on Nycos the argument that if you do not know the history, the errors of the past, you're doomed to repeat them. The issue here is that if you do not have the histories of the past, you have no way to know when you're repeating them. So, therefore, the iterations that were historically aware of each other from first iteration, well, not really first, but from second iteration all the way to 7th, that rule has now been broken because of what the 8th iteration did. Or sorry, the 7th iteration did. So what we'll talk about a little bit on the iteration arc is a series of things concerning the rise and fall of awareness of a great and powerful weapon / tool that in the ending days of each iteration fundamentally built the tech and capability of the next iteration. And because they were aware of each other, second iteration, third iteration, even fourth iteration are considered to be the dark period, because the prophecies were all seen as fearful notes from the gods. And the 5th, 6th, and 7th are called the bright iterations, because in those iterations the players not only were aware of what was coming, but were able to start planning. You didn't do nothing, Cody. Yeah, okay, I know you didn't. That's exactly what you did. Nothing. I like that phrase. It's very good. It's very good. All right, so you can see that in the chat that Travis is clearly an 8th iteration entity, whereas Cody has a bit of a toehold in the 7th. Okay, he is responsible for the ending of the 7th. Not personally, but his group. Anyway, don't want to bore you too much with bickering back and forth, but the concept of the iterations was simply this. I wrote a story that I wanted to tell, but I wanted the story to be able to be told in its own context. Therefore, each iteration's solution depended on what the players of that iteration chose to do. So in the first iteration, quite honestly, I didn't even know what I was doing. I hadn't even mapped an entire continent at that point. As a matter of fact, I had a small portion of one of the lands. involved. And within that framework, I built the rest of the arc because the prophecies spoke of places that the players had never been and arguably in their lifespan would never get to actually visit. So that second iteration truly is the first time they had to play through the whole arc. So let's talk a little bit about 7th. In 7th iteration, there were a couple of mitigating factors that I have to admit before we poke any fingers at the players in that iteration or the decisions that they made. First of which is that I was actually going to have to end the campaign prematurely at about the 3-year mark instead of finishing the complete 6 years. But the players were adamant that they wanted to understand and at least have an experience with all that the story might one day carry. So we put them on a high-speed mode. I gave them a couple of MacGuffin items to get them to be able to accomplish incredibly difficult tasks in relatively short periods of time so that they would be able to reach an awareness, at least, of what had happened in the past. And I think the wistfulness that I must have had at the time about getting ready to move must have worn off a bit on my players because, as I said, in their defense, they thought they were going to do me a favor. They had realized that the story had this finite arc. There was a beginning and an end. And they could see that I was stressed without being able to complete the end. And so they determined that the best thing they could do, yes, like I said, a MacGuffin. I was going to leave it at that. Thanks, Cody. Thanks for pointing out that I had to go to even earthly fantasy to make it work. Thanks a lot. Anyway, yes, Santa did help. But the reality was that the players saw the wistfulness in me and determined that the best thing they could do to help me was to simply reset the world. Let's take out the story arc from its beginning, the very beginning of the curve, take it all off the table, and create a new version of the world that Jonathan can now use to create his own new story that isn't the old one. But he's not depending on those old pieces anymore. Yeah. Thanks, guys. They did succeed in creating a 7-fold wish, and in that 7-fold wish, they established racial identity or genetic identity for the sect gen, taking them out of the human gene pool. They established and identified the Goliath, the giant race, as its own genetic race, and in particular that it was not beholden to the giant clans and all of that. Instead, they were their own standalone and could operate whichever governmental system that they chose. They attempted to eliminate the Eldrin races that were adversarial to the world and adversarial to any but their own kind, attempting to eliminate the forms of racism. Unfortunately, the casting of their 7-fold wish that 7-fold wish, bless their hearts, the players did not have perfect knowledge. They weren't aware of all of the different races that their magics would have to affect for it to fully accomplish this task. They believed that they could interact and merge all of the elves into a singular, friendly race to humanity. They thought they could remove the stigma from the scorn, the half-elves, and make them more acceptable to the elves in general. and they anticipated they would be able to quash a persistent set of rulings known as the Pact that had not only interfered with 6th iteration but with 7th as well. In the process, what they successfully did was eliminate all of the written records of any history from the minds and written libraries of all of the standard races in the game. In doing so, it made for a more, if you will, nerfed origin, which happened to coincide really, really well with the 5th edition rules, which are fairly nerfed. Yeah, Travis doesn't like the Pact. I don't think Cody likes the Pact much either. I think that's one of the reasons why he was so glad to be able to establish a true monarchy for the Goliaths in his era. But the fact that the Pact wasn't quashed led indirectly, and the fact that the action that the players took that was clearing out the histories fundamentally was a, if you will, very energetic powerhouse driving backwards through time, obliterating anything that came into contact with it that couldn't resist it. And that therein is the rub, if you will, to Nycos, and that is throughout time, from 1st iteration down, there are villains and even benevolent powers that had the capacity to stand against the effect that would obliterate them from existence. That never spell could be held off, if not prevented altogether. And it is around these fixed points chronologically that storms develop. And a storm can be something as simple as a farmer who just doesn't want to recognize that his daughter was taken from him because she couldn't have existed, to entire countries going to war with their neighbors from a different time, to individual raiders mounting their airships and engaging with the storms as a fungible resource, in effect, that they raid these storms and steal stuff from chronological fixed points that normally wouldn't be able to be accessed. So with that awareness, then we can turn a little bit more to the current situation. You see, the iterations have, from this position in time known as the now, echoed backwards all the way to 1st iteration. As a matter of fact, there were 12 days of overlap where the never effect pushed beyond the boundaries of real time, and those manifested as 12 days of time going the wrong direction, of the planet actually orbiting in reverse. And I'm reading text. Yes, Travis has got a good analogy there, that it's creating whirls and eddies just like a wave that hits the coastline. And the difference here is that the powerhouses are their own entities, so I consider it to be more along the line of each of these holes in time, these places where time isn't moving, to be themselves the powerhouses. And so in order to close a loop, to shut down one of these eddies, you fundamentally have to go in and find out what is the great force holding the space in place, and then eliminate it. And there's even at least one group that have as their agenda literally popping the bubbles in the wrap of time. So, alrighty, we are at. Oh, I've still got another 15 minutes. Good. Okay. So the next thing we're going to talk about, we talked about positioning, and we talked a little bit about the iterations. let's talk about culture. Nycos is fully populated, which means I've mapped out what all creatures are where. Now, does that mean there are some that I haven't mapped yet? No, that does not mean that at all, because there are places, despite my best efforts, there are places on Nycos where character footprints have not yet been made. I know it's going to be staggering to those of you that play, thinking with all the years that I've run games, but there are literally civilizations that have risen, ascended, gone to war with each other, been obliterated, knocked back to the Stone Age, and restarted, that have never, ever been interacted with by players. And to me, that's one of the really cool things about the Nycos environment, is that even if the players choose to go someplace we haven't before, it just gives me an opportunity to dig a little deeper into the very lore that I created long ago. Yep, temporal bubble wrap, exactly. All right, so since there are all these different cultures, I could have made it so that every single culture had its own religion and its own gods, but the world has been through a lot. It has been through the 6.5 year playing arc, which is roughly 150 to 200 years real time, depending on the players. I actually had one that actually lasted closer to 1,000 years, but that was because everybody was not of mortal race. They were of the gifted ones, so to say, shall we say. And each of these iterations, the players had to deal with the gods and things like that. So it finally dawned on me that if we've been doing this over and again, and the players have infiltrated into the different groups over and again, then the odds are that the gods that the players would interact with would be those that would be available to them in the current era. Now, since 5th iteration was the last iteration with interplanetary and interdimensional being involvement, that means that, and that's exactly why the limitation is placed that there can only be a very limited number of Dragonborn, a very few Tiefling, and a very low ASMR in the session, because they are descendants from a world that literally doesn't exist. Since Nycos hasn't had access to those planes, there's no way for the creatures that come from those planes to create the progeny that those races represent. Of course, 7th iteration, once again, bless their hearts, put the world right back where it had been before, which means it made it susceptible to extra-dimensional beings again. And so, therefore, dragons return. In addition to dragons returning, so did the demonic forces and the angelic forces, as well as extra-dimensional beings from every imaginable other plane. That's led to a lot of confusion and twistiness in the story, if you will. So, therefore, is actually the concept of the 6th iteration, that they didn't want to be recognized as gods. Since there were no more god references, they knew that people would still try to hold on to them, and so they insisted on concealing their identities and became known as the priests of the veils. And these, at the time, 7 veils represented the primary color spectrum from red all the way to violet. Excuse me. And therefore, these 7 faiths developed. Well, spend another 300 years before the end of the 7th, before the beginning of the Never, which is a gap that I don't think even my players sitting here in the room are aware of. But the priesthood now expanded to 10 veils, or what are known as the 10 constants. And that's red, orange, yellow, blue, green, indigo, purple, indigo, white, black, and gray. So Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, black, white, and gray. Happen to also be the colors of electronics, by the way, those of you that are taking notes. I don't know where I came up with it, having had a history in electronics, but there you have it. Anyway, these priests that stepped into the gap became icons not for true religiosity. They weren't expecting worship for themselves or whatever, but rather icons for their representative ideologies. And on a subsequent video, I'll go through each of the colors and what they mean and how they interact with one another. But I am coming up on, let's see here, I still got another 20 minutes, so I do have other things I want to get to, so I will not be going any farther into the veils at this point. Just know that veil adherence isn't necessary, but in most cultures on the planet, one or more of the veils is hailed as God and revered as such. So now let's talk a little bit about magicals. And the magical theory is this. Now that we understand that the material that comes to Nycos as radiation, as this extra band, the material that it's made up of in its process of transiting is called a magical. And I spell it like particle, M-A-G-I-C-L-E. And a wizard or a sorcerer or a warlock is manipulating the very, very material around him by affecting the magicals. And each source affects them differently. Excuse me. Need a reset button here. But anyway, the thing you need to know about magicals is that as it comes into the planet's atmosphere as magicals, it is a non-sentient, directable energy source. After it has been compressed in any way, whether it's forced into service as an envelope for a magic user's effect, or whether it's being burned as a fuel source because it's trapped in the soil or the ash of Nycos, or whatever, the more times it interacts with adverse forces that force it to do things, the more aware it becomes. At the highest form, the material that is identifiable as magic can take several forms. Atmospherically, a high concentration of magic will manifest as silver linings for the clouds. Also silver glints on the tops of trees, or silver sheen on the crest of snow. These are all places where magicals at rest tend to combine and congregate. They're not doing it on any particular reason, they just are. Hey Olivia, how are you doing? Glad to have you with us. Therefore, with magic having no will, if you will, at first, it simply congregates with others of its kind, and therefore you will find occasionally, especially on the horizon, pools of limb. And I think part of the irony here is that here on Earth, the closest you can see to seeing anything from Nycos is go out into the desert and look across the horizon, and you'll see exactly what I'm speaking of. Tiny pools of almost ethereal material hovering just above the surface in little bundles and little groups. And some of them can be massive. Sometimes they can be as large as lakes, which arguably can be kind of frightening in itself. Olivia, just so you catch you up real quick, we are involved with the discussion of the origins of Nycos, my games world, and I'm kind of going over some of the particular points of interest that an observer, and namely somebody who's watching the streams, might want to have a handle on when hearing the conversations, because a lot of what we talk about in-game ties to these different particulars. And clearly at this point we're already into the story. Exactly. Stick your feet in. Nothing could go possibly wrong with sticking your feet into pools. No one's ever done that. Okay. Nor has anybody ever drank the material. Okay, so it is in different iterations called different things. And in the past, it was easy to identify and describe because it was written of in the lore. But since the records don't exist, I'm hard-pressed to actually use the terms from the previous iterations, except to say that players have actually visited those iterations and might have actually heard the terms. So the first term you might have heard is lim, L-I-M, and that is short. That is a short term for what is actually called limnus, L-I-M-N-I-S. The term actually comes from the word that means light, and it literally means living light. So limnus is itself illuminated, and it can illuminate other things. This is one of the reasons why many magic spells have a very visual effect. So, yeah, okay, there we go. Yeah, I already. Oh, nice, thanks. Thanks for checking that out, Travis. Yeah, I went over there and looked at it at first to make sure it was still working. So glad the channel's still there. Yay! Mission accomplished. Thanks again to Travis, yet another of the names I didn't mention earlier in putting this all together, but he's been around for a really long time, so he's part of the wallflower background. Yeah, that's what I'm going to stick with. Ha! Anyway, the other name for lim is Daemonarch, and Daemonarch is what it was called when it was in its wild state. You see, magic as it was originally was just the energy by which spells were cast. And a particular villain had found a use for, let's just say, a magical device to actually concentrate the magicals in such a way that he could imbue them into weapons and things like that. Exactly, Travis. So Daemonarch is what it was called. That this villain who was starting to capture the material intended to use it to open a gate to a place where he could draw power from. At the time, the Nycos was not yet accessible to the outer planes nor the inner planes, but rather extra-dimensionally a space was reached into, and another alien race known as, well, let's just call them the Others for now. They came in contact with the evil villain, and despite his best efforts, overran his position and began to use his facility to transport into Nycos not only the primary large races, but also the small and more incidental species from this other world. The players, realizing this was not the best possible use for such a device, actually infiltrated the location and dismantled his device, and in the process left operating only the functionality of concentrating magic over time. They didn't know that he had it, they didn't know how it worked, and they didn't think about leaving it operating. And so for almost all of the fourth iteration, the universe was in a ultimate state of chaos because the energy had become aware and wasn't going to let itself be used by spellcasters like that anymore, unless an agreement was reached. So, this is also a piece that hasn't been revealed in a really long time, so you guys in this particular conversation, and those that watch it later, we'll be getting some serious insight into what's going on. In that, once the magicals were free from the mold, they got to choose success or failure, and they began to therefore manifest the personalities of the characters that had become instrumental in their existences, and therefore became as gods. Not gods, but it became identifiably manipulative and ridiculously powerful and willing to interfere. So therefore, those players who have been visited by gods have actually been visited by sentient piles of magic bent on manipulating them. All right, so we're coming down to the. What do I have left now? I've got 10 minutes left. So the one more kind of thing that I want to go into is the various episodic locations that we are in and kind of where those stories are headed, so that the viewer can understand why A, you want to see all of them, and B, how they interact with one another, and C, why you as a subscriber will want to take advantage of getting to play with us in the sessions. So I'll go through them, starting with the first of the week, which is the Sunday stream. The Sunday stream is known as Whisper in the Winds. It is set in the very valley where the Never began, and the adjacent hillside and coastline are the stomping grounds of the players. There is so much information that they can gather here that I recommend the Sunday stream extensively for additional lore gathering. It'll be a resource for you as the viewer, and the NPCs that you get to play will be in some ways perhaps more wise and more useful if you have kept track with the other episodes. So although Sunday is the first one, it's also arguably one of the stronger ones to watch. That's a cool idea, Travis. Gather a group together. I still have a couple of days I'm not running games. As a matter of fact, Cody would probably be into that as well, because he's been pretty instrumental on the Friday stream. But we'll get to that in a minute. Moving on to Monday. Monday is our, I would call it our beginners stream, in that it is adventurers running around on Nycos, experiencing all of the craziness without all of the technicality. They're a fun group. They love the interchange and engagement with one another and with the story, but they are not going to be really lore rich other than by incidents. On the other hand, I will be throwing at them things that will be tidbits of possible story hooks that the other players and the other groups may run into. Travis specifically, I'm looking at possibly Tuesday for that if you put together a decent group. So those of you in the stream or that are watching this, if you are not yet participating in one of my games, realize that I do play at the Gameology game store in Upland, California. I still have open spaces in a few of my games and a couple of days left in the week to fulfill my objective, which is to get to streaming every day. I do want to mention in the stream and with every stream that I am absolutely dedicated to giving you guys additional content every single day. So the sooner I can get to that level, the better. But I digress. So Monday is a group of fun folk. They're aboard an airship, and it looks like they're going to be doing the world tour exercise version of the Nycos world. Oh, welcome -101010. I like that. That's a great name. We are getting to the closing minutes of this episode, but once we're done, you definitely want to go back and watch all of it. This is an introduction to Nycos and gives you some information about the world and what's going on within it. I've just been talking about the Sunday and Monday streams, so now I'm going to mention the Wednesday stream. They are my most veteran players in this iteration. They are in the early teen levels of Dungeons and Dragons, so they are 12th to 15th level, which means they're pretty much heavy hitters and are reluctantly being drawn into a more lore-heavy story arc than they have been in, and that's only because they are nearing the end of the book campaign that we set them up on. See, Cody wants to play, Travis. There's 2. Just need to get 4 more, and we'll do another show. So Wednesday's story arc is on the epic level. They are fighting and driving off actual demonic influences that have broken through, and furthermore, they're being led indirectly by a outworlder himself, a Azamar, calls himself an angel second class, who's working at maybe actually angel first class by now, but he's working his way towards his eventual return to the plane once he has won Nycos for his particular brand of lawful goodness. So we'll see how that goes in the long term. The Wednesday. Oh, good thing about the Wednesday game. All of my sessions during the week start at 6 p.m. The Friday stream sometimes will lag till 7 because one of my players, namely Cody, that's in the chat room, can't always make it at the beginning of the session, and so what I will be more than likely doing is doing like recaps and things like that to buy some time for him to get here. But I want to try to start at 6 o'clock each night on the weeknights. And on the weekends, right now, Sunday is my only weekend game, and that's at 1 o'clock p.m., and we run until 5. So, okay. You're currently in a campaign with your co-workers. You're a druid, forest, gnome. Oh, that's funny. That's funny. You may want to look into animal companions, because as a gnome, you could certainly perhaps summon up a puppy dog, I don't know, a Great Dane or something that is large enough to carry you and can carry you at the party's speed, and therefore give you a little bit more autonomy. Unless, of course, you enjoy being carried around. I sometimes like getting carried away personally, and that's another story altogether. That is awesome, though, Olivia. So the Wednesday game is at 6 p.m. All right. So the next game past the Wednesday session, I actually have a Thursday game. It's very they call themselves investigators, but they are operating privately. They are all Patreon upper level sponsors. So if you wish to, for example, have me run a home game for you, you could use the same process, become a Patreon supporter, put together a group of people that would do the same, and then we'll coordinate for whichever day of the week you want me to run. The next one after that is Friday, and Friday is Fellstone Chronicles, and both Cody and Travis are in that game. And while it's a bit investigative in nature, it also has a bit of, let's just say, there are qualities among the players that fit into what I have defined as mutants, and that is a conversation, again, for another video where I go into the physiognomy of a player character. But their mutant nature has led them to actually pursuing a specific course of finding, recovering, and then repositioning the Fellstones, objects that have fallen from the heavens in the aftermath of the 8th iteration after the Never. and are endeavoring to accomplish those goals while also getting themselves into as much mischief as possible. Yes. Once again, Travis mentions a bit of that physiognomy, which is the idea that there is some alien influence in that session, and that is certainly the case. So we have talked through the sessions themselves. We've talked about the backgrounds of Nycos and the origins thereof. Next episode of this type, next Monday, we will do the philosophies and religions of Nycos throughout the iterations. Thank you for your participation in this episode. Thank you for being in the chat. I love the conversation. It was very enjoyable, and I look forward to seeing everyone at the next possible time. Do remember that tonight at 6 p.m. is Winds of the West, my Monday campaign, and they are, for the first time, launching out into the Great Blue Yonder, or the Great Mauve Yonder. Yeah, there we go. The Great Mauve Yonder, aboard the airship Borealis. So make sure you catch up with us at 6 p.m. tonight on this same channel, Nycos DnD. See you then. Do check out our Patreon. The button's down below for that. And hope to see you again soon. This is Jonathan Alvin, the Game Market Guru, signing off.